All right, well, thanks for coming, everybody. My name is Jim Aiken. I am the Vice President at BARR Engineering. I'm also, we're not big on titles at BARR, but I'm our CCR Program Director, which is an internal title. And it means I'm the lead cat herder for the CCR work that we do. So we have numerous qualified professional engineers that do this work, as well as a couple of subject matters, which I am. And this paper is a combination of my work as well as Kevin Soley, who's also one of the BARR SMEs on CCR. So before I start, I just want to kind of get a sense of my audience here. How many of you are familiar with the CCR rule? Know what CCR stands for, which is coal combustion residuals? Great. And then second of all, how many are familiar with the Part A, Part B, and consent orders that EPA has issued? Is that new? Okay, good. So I'll explain those a little bit. And finally, how many of you are attending this conference with a spouse or significant other and spending Valentine's Day in Dallas? All right, just wondering. All right, so the nexus, the origins of this talk was a presentation that Kevin and I gave at EUEC last spring. And really what we did was we said, okay, EPA has come out with the Part A, Part B, at these demonstrations that were voluntarily submitted to EPA, and EPA, because they had to demonstrate full compliance with the CCR rule, it was a gold mine of information about how EPA is actually interpreting the CCR rule and how they view folks' actions under it. And really, it's the only real guidance that we've had under the CCR rule. They haven't issued any real specific guidance, a few little tweaky details about reporting. That's it. So this is our standard of care. This is how we develop the standard of care, is understanding what the expectation is. Despite the fact that for the last 30 years we've been implementing monitoring programs and groundwater statistics under Subtitle D of RCRA upon the advent of the MSW rules, which the CCR is largely based on. The other thing is really the goal here is to address kind of three things. Give you that background on the Part A's and Part B's and those EPA determinations. That's kind of the basics here. But really I want to take it a step further. I want to give you specific tools that you can use in the event that you are challenged by EPA on some of your work under the CCR rule. So this is really intended to give you ammunition. You guys and the consultants are the guns. Kevin and I are giving you the ammunition to use. So to bolster yourself, protect yourself, defend yourself, particularly against enforcement actions. But I know many of you have heard from the EPA and have gotten some vexing questions from. And then finally, I want to take that information and see what we can do to apply it to the new legacy rule, which is coming out, we expect, in May, and it brings in a whole new universe of new sites to consider under the same provisions, essentially, as the original CCR rule. So the title of this slide wasn't originally fiction or non-compliance. It actually was more about the findings. But then this came out, which is the nastygram from EPA that says basically y'all doing it wrong. There's widespread non-compliance with the CCR rule, which is frustrating for many of us that have been working on this now as a major part of our work for the last, in some cases beyond, starting in 2011, started looking at potential changes ever since Kingston TDA. We sort of knew that there was something coming. But I want to focus on something specific. When Richard Huggins was asked in New Orleans last year, who was then the program director for EPA under the CCR, the question was asked, hey, how come we do our best, we've done all this work, and yet what we're hearing from EPA is we're not good enough. This is our job, and you're telling us you're not doing good enough. And Richard replied that the EPA, in the defense of EPA, Richard said, we believe that we have appropriately and conservatively interpreted the CCR rule, and we are applying it in that manner. So that's the statement. He went on to say, hey, if you have a particular thing, go ahead and contact us, but we know that they don't really have the staff to talk to you, so setting up a meeting with the EPA is going to be a challenge. So what I wanted to is I just want to leave that with you and have you guys think about that as I go through this and ask yourself, has EPA appropriately and conservatively interpreted the rule? And to that sense, does the EPA have to acknowledge science and fact, the standard of care of our industry? And then knowing that EPA is making these criticisms, hasn't, in most cases, provided supporting evidence for some of the criticisms. Make sure that you're aware of those and potentially some tools to defend yourself or better bolster your arguments to make them more powerful. And then finally, the legacy rule is really an opportunity to take what we've learned and apply it to these new sites that might be coming in that have to be investigated in some cases and closed. So that's kind of where we're heading. I'll get into the Part A, Part Bs. I'm going to do a pretty fast review of that, just in the interest of time. For reference, this information, and then I'm going to talk about the legacy rule, but for reference, there's a detailed write-up on our website, BARR.com. Just search for CCR and they'll take you to this paper. I haven't updated it yet, but I did add Waukegan and Greenidge, which are new elements here, new sites that we looked at. But essentially, Kevin and I split the work up. We each took these sites and we listed every single finding that EPA had. We removed the ones that were repetitive. So if a site had 5 different CCR units and they did the same thing wrong, we only counted as one. But I also want to point out that our booth, which is now 520, there's some reprints available on a limited basis. If you want to just swing by and pick up some of that, and that includes this slide presentation as well as the April 23 original research that we did. And then, of course, I believe these slides will be available. So, summary of issues. So we looked through all these 17 sites. We came up, or at the time, 15 sites, and we came up with 4 buckets. One is network site characterization. So this is installing wells, characterizing your site, developing your conceptual site model, which, by the way, is not a rule requirement, but it's a convenient way that we've used for the last 30 years to characterize sites. Certifications and reporting is another common bucket with 42 total citations. I'm not going to talk a lot about it today. Some of it was ticky-tack, to be honest with you. There's some interesting things, but really they come down to reading the rule and deciding what it is. And EPA, again, like every other category, has made assertions that you should do this or you should do that, but again, it's not in the rule that way. So you're kind of left with, okay, for example, if I modify my network, do I have to recertify my network? Well, the rule doesn't say you have to do that. What it does say is you're supposed to put changes in the annual report. So there's all kinds of little issues like that. I won't go into more detail on today. So I can spend a little time on statistics, which was a very common area that the EPA cited deficiencies, as well as ASDs. And this is a really interesting one. And this is really the nexus of that question to Richard, which was, other than the one ASD the EPA agreed with, which was a faulty pH meter, so that's a rationale that they could get on board with. The industry is 0 for 42 and counting. And that means that there's been new ones that they've also been rejected. And I should probably mention that the Part A's, Part B's, they also are, sorry, you're not good enough. And then I forgot to mention the consent orders. Consent orders have a lot less information. They're just not as useful because it's all kind of done in the smoky back room, I guess, and they don't put any more information in there than they need to. So what did they say about network characterization? And this is where I get to say, hey, let's give EPA some credit. They did point out in some cases that there just simply wasn't enough information for the QPE to certify the network. They didn't put enough borings in. They did not fully develop a conceptual site model. And what I like to say is, hey, if you have an understanding of your site, you should be able to tell someone exactly where the flow of water is and where it's on the upgradient side of a land, where is upgradient, and where it's going to end up when it passes underneath the landfill or impoundment. That's kind of what a conceptual model is in its essence. You know where things are going. You've got enough information to document things there. And in many cases, people didn't do that, and they left really obvious pathways unmonitored. That being said, EPA said this about some sites that were clearly it wasn't necessary to monitor things. For example, they seem to assert that you should put in side gradient wells. Well, that's not in the rule. But what they're saying is, well, how do you know that the groundwater isn't somehow taking a hard right underneath your site and going somewhere else? And the reason is we have science and math to make those determinations. But they will say those things, and typically you'll find that that's unsupported with really any site-specific data. A couple of common ones I just wanted to highlight here. And normally I don't cram my slides full of words, but I want this to be a resource for you, so I'm just going to hit the highlights in the white. Waste boundary. So EPA said that less than 100 feet from the waste boundary is too far away because they repeat that the rule says the wells must be solved at the waste boundary. I think many of you that have experience with putting in monitorings will tell you that's a pretty risky proposition because you may in fact put the well in ash, which isn't fun. That's not a very good detection monitoring well. There's also a credible argument for saying that we should put the well further away from the waste boundary, and that argument is based on the principles of dispersivity and diffusion in an aquifer. So you can make some arguments here that can support your case that the wells need to be set back further. That was rarely done in any of these determinations. So there's also a technique called Pinder plots, where you can actually plot the vectors of flow and their change over time. So you can use these tools, knowing that this argument is out there. You can use some of these tools to make a stronger case for what you're doing. Finally, lateral spacing. This was a good one. So is 2,500 feet too far apart for your wells in your network? Yeah, maybe. That's a half mile. That's pretty far apart. But then at another site, they say, well, 200 feet is too far apart. And as my colleague Kevin Soley says, there's never a time when somebody can't argue you need more wells. The question is making the argument of what is sufficient. And so what we recommend is looking at the overall geology and making arguments saying, hey, if it's a relatively homogeneous and you've got reproducible, non-variable flow rates, it isn't a very compelling argument to say you never know, groundwater could be going somewhere else. If the data shows that it's going in a direction and it fits your conceptual site model, that should be good enough. The simplest explanation is the best. So, but I do think that you can make those arguments, say, the homogeneity, the relative homogeneity of the aquifer is an argument you can make to support that. So statistics. I just want to focus, there's a lot to go through on statistics, and if you're not a statistician, don't worry, I'm not going to dig into it too much. You do need to know, in listening to what I'm going to say, two terms. One is interwell, which is it's an interwell comparison. That's a comparison of your groundwater data on the upgradient side of the landfill to the wells on the downgradient side of the landfill. So this is called up versus down. What you do is you pool the upgradient data from all your wells and all your samples, and you create a prediction interval that sets a threshold for that parameter. Then, when you get a new event, downgradient, you compare it to that limit, and if it's over, you have what's called a statistically significant increase, SSI. So intrawell then is, instead of comparing up versus down, you compare the statistics from a single downgradient well to its own historical data. And if you can demonstrate that you don't have an increasing trend or something like that, that looks like it's outside of the limits, or it's within the limits, but it looks like there's something else going on, then that's a reason why you can use intrawell. What EPA says is, no, you can't use interwell. Interwell's bad. Here's why. It's masking the effects of a release, because the only appropriate instance where you install intrawell is when you have a well at a site that existed before waste was placed there. Okay, folks, none of this is in the CCR rule. So if you're looking back to the rule and say, okay, what's the basis for what they're saying? And they'll cite 257.91 as the rationale, but they won't cite the language in it because the rule doesn't say any of that. In fact, if you go to the EPA's own guidance document, this is called the Unified Guidance, published in March 2009. It's kind of a bit of the Bible for a lot of hydrogeologists looking at statistics and how to do what's appropriate, what's not, because it has a really detailed discussion and some how-to examples. It's a really great document. And in that document, and I've highlighted in red, it basically says that the way to go is intrawell. Upgradient comparisons make a false assumption, and that is that the geologic environment has spatial stationarity of the mean. That means that regardless of where you look in the upgradient or downgradient geologic environment, the mean of the samples collected from that location will fall in the same distribution. And you'll be able to compare it well to well and all be spatially consistent. That never happens. That is That is not something that happens in the natural world. You could engineer an aquifer with glass beads that would approximate this assumption. But for the rest of us, heterogeneity in the geologic environment is the rule, not the exception. So what EPA is saying here just simply isn't backed up by science, or more importantly, the standard of care that's been established for over 30 years in our industry of monitoring landfills and impoundments. I just want to point out another point that Dan reminded of when it comes to EPA staff. So in at least 2 occasions where I've been involved in enforcement actions and had to walk through with EPA staff on what we did for our ASDs and why, I've had to explain what trend testing is. So that's where you look at to see if there's an increasing trend. You might be within your intra-well limits, but there's an increasing trend. And they weren't familiar with trend testing. They weren't familiar with population statistical comparisons. So you compare 2 populations and see if they're similar. Or what's a commonly used tool called a Piper-Stiff diagram, which I don't expect any of you to know what it is, but if you're in the world of groundwater and groundwater compliance, this is an essential tool. And the fact that I had to explain that to EPA staff means that whoever's reviewing this really isn't qualified to make a determination on what good ASD looks like. And I'm not saying that about all of it. I have no idea how the sausage is being made at EPA, but all I know is the person I talked to on 2 occasions did not have a grasp of these basic types of things. So again, with ASDs, I think EPA was right to point out in some cases there's a lack of rigor. People just kind of throwing stuff out there like, yeah, boron's regionally high, no big deal. That's not good enough. I don't think anyone should be satisfied with just one line of evidence, especially if it's an indirect line of evidence that's not based on the site itself. Take the time, collect the data, and I think if you do, that's where you really do have a strong argument. So instead of just saying regional data, start to collect background data, have a robust data set, and really look at where the boron, what the distribution of boron and other parameters are. In other cases, EPA says that the source, when you do an alternative source demonstration, the rule says that you have to demonstrate it's a source other than the CCR unit. It doesn't say that you have to point the finger at some other specific source of contamination. And EPA has interpreted that as, no, the rule requires that you identify a source. And I am sorry, I don't see that in the rule anywhere. I think that's a really good example of an interpretation the EPA has made that really requires substantially more support technically than what they've given. I'm just going to skip that and just talk about one of our, kind of one of my favorite arguments is the release suite argument, and that's suite as in a hotel suite. So if you have a release from an impoundment or a landfill, the theory goes that this would be leachate from the bottom of the unit going into the groundwater table. And that leachate would be a mixture, right? So it would be a solute of all of the things that make up ash and or other CCRs, scrubber solids. And the fact that you would only see one of those in a down-gradient well should be a red flag. So if I only see boron, but I should see calcium, sulfate, chloride, I should see TDS, I should see all of these things going together, that should be a red flag that there's something else going on and potentially not related to the CCR unit. So the problem with that for EPA is that they themselves actually, in the preamble, say the reason they selected these was precisely because they're mobile in the environment and not reactive. And what their response is, oh no, these are reactive. You don't know what could happen to them in the subsurface. They could precipitate. They could absorb to the media. Anyway, so they'd be attenuated. Hence, not mobile is in direct contradiction to what they've actually said. So that's some of it. So with the time I have here, and does somebody know 2 minutes? Oh, 1 minute. Okay. So here's the legacy rule. We've kind of gone over this a little bit earlier. The blue is stuff that's already in the 2015 CCR rule. The yellow and the green are the new stuff. The red is areas that are supposedly out of the CCR legacy rule. And I should probably back up for those who weren't here earlier. The CCR legacy rule is an extension of the original CCR rule that was derived from something called the EUEC decision, where the court said, EPA, you've made such a big deal about how hazardous these things are. Go back and make sure that these other things are now included. So these are going to be a new universe of sites that are going to be potentially have to be monitored just like these old ones. So what do we need to know about all of this information I just went over and how we can apply it to the legacy rule? So the first is we have a reset on groundwater. So a lot of the original rule, we sort of went with existing monitoring networks that we had in place. They were good enough for the state program, for example. So let's just use those. We never actually, for a lot of sites, never did a really robust investigation. In this case, a lot of these are going to be unmonitored. Don't hesitate to collect the information. We now know that EPA is going to be watching. They're going to be looking at these critically. Make sure that you have a robust conceptual site model and be able to counter potential arguments against what you're doing. Be rigorous, be stalwart. So defend your, don't be afraid to show your work, defend your certifications and your opinions, and be firm and expect that others should be as equally as firm in providing evidence that you're wrong. Pond closures, there's a lot of tools to be used, and in some of these newer determinations, there was problems EPA pointed out with sufficient sampling density, but also the criteria that was used to determine that the CCR was in fact all removed. There's tools that are mineralogical, for example, that are rarely used that we found to be pretty effective, just based on the unique mineralogy of ash and scrubber solids. So also, one idea we have is to revisit the NOTA, which is a Notice of Data Availability the EPA put out to defend the basis for the CCR legacy rule. There's a risk-based argument to be made there where they've said that 18,000 tons of CCR is not necessarily a risk. And then also consider, what about the situations where there is infrastructure built over CCR? What arguments can we make for that? I think in all these cases, the key is defensible data with rigorous support, using multiple lines of evidence, and also including third-party supporting opinions. If you haven't looked into hiring a third-party consultant, I encourage you to do so. We advise of our clients. And the idea is to not have a consultant to poke holes in what you're doing, but actually to support and work collaboratively to defend your positions. So fact or fiction, appropriate, conservative, I'll leave it to you, but none of us should inject speculation over defensible facts and data. With that, I'll leave it to questions if we have any time. Yeah. So any questions? Hearing none? No. Going once, going twice. So I have a question. So does anybody have a favorite alternative source demonstration argument that they think is really strong and that the EPA will never be able to defeat? I have an example I call the gold, my colleague Kevin actually called it the gold standard, and that is where you have data that precedes the actual placement of waste on the property. In that case, you've got a pretty solid argument. If you've got high levels of chloride or other things in your groundwater, it seems to me you should have a pretty strong argument that it's not related to the facility. I will tell you, some of you know this as well, even that, the gold standard wasn't good enough for the EPA. They still criticized that. So, all right, well, thank you, everybody. Thanks. Just going to shut this down. It's supposed to be lingering around. All right. So are you the carbon capture or?
I am. Well, I'm on a phone.
Oh, okay. I'll let you do it then. It's right here.